I thought I'd already seen every rare American pickup, but I was completely wrong. Some of these trucks were built in tiny numbers, others came from forgotten brands, and a few look nothing like a pickup at all. Stay with me, because number 10 is one most people have never even seen.
Number 1. 1938 Mack ED. Honestly, I had to look twice when I first came across this truck, because if someone showed you a picture of a 1938 Mack and asked you to guess what it was, you would probably expect a giant, intimidating work truck, something built to haul enormous loads, with the kind of heavy-duty appearance that made the Mack name famous. But then you see this, and suddenly the whole image of Mack changes. This is the 1938 Mack ED, and it might be one of the strangest little chapters in Mack's history. Mack was already well known for building tough commercial trucks, but in the late 1930s, the company decided to experiment with something completely different, a much smaller truck aimed at customers who didn't need a massive heavy-duty machine. And that's exactly why the ED is so fascinating. It wasn't simply a smaller Mack by accident. Mack deliberately created it for a completely different kind of buyer. Think about the America of 1938 for a moment. The country was still recovering from the Great Depression. Businesses were trying to save money wherever they could. Farmers needed practical transportation. Small companies needed delivery vehicles. And not everyone could afford or even justify owning a huge commercial truck. A compact truck that could handle everyday work without the size and expense of a heavy-duty Mack made a lot of sense. But Mack's solution looked almost bizarre compared with the company's traditional trucks. The ED had a much smaller, lighter appearance, and at first glance it almost doesn't belong in the same family as those legendary Mack workhorses. That's what makes it so interesting today. You can look at it and think, wait, Mack actually built this? And then comes the number that completely changes the story. Only 2,686 examples were produced between 1938 and 1941. That may sound like a lot until you realize how quickly a working truck could disappear. These weren't museum pieces when they were new. They were tools. Owners bought them to work. They carried equipment, delivered goods, traveled rough roads, and spent years being exposed to weather and hard use. When something broke, it was repaired. When a part wore out, it was replaced. And when the truck finally became too old to make economic sense, there was little reason for an owner to preserve it simply because it was historically important. That's the cruel reality of old work trucks. The vehicles that survived aren't always the most important ones. They're often the ones that were lucky enough to escape the scrapyard. And the Mack ED had another problem. It wasn't the kind of truck that became instantly legendary. People remembered the enormous Macks. They remembered the trucks that looked powerful and unmistakable. The little ED didn't have that same reputation. Over time, it became a forgotten model, a truck that existed in Mack's history but slowly disappeared from people's memories. Imagine that. Somewhere in the late 1930s, a customer could walk into a Mack dealership and actually order one of these. It was a brand new Mack. It carried the same famous name, but instead of looking like a monster of the road, it was compact, practical, and surprisingly approachable. Nobody buying one in 1938 could have known that decades later, enthusiasts would struggle just to find a surviving example. And this is where I think the story gets even more interesting. When you see a surviving Mack ED today, you're not simply seeing an old pickup, you're seeing evidence of a direction Mack once considered for its future. The company was testing the idea that the Mack name didn't necessarily mean gigantic trucks. Maybe there was room for a smaller Mack, a truck for businesses and owners who needed something more manageable. For a while, that idea existed in the form of the ED. But history moved on. The automotive industry changed, truck buyers changed, America changed, and the Mack ED slowly disappeared into the background. Thousands of people probably drove these trucks without ever imagining that their ordinary work vehicle would one day become a rare piece of automotive history. That's why finding one today would be incredible. Imagine walking through an old farm property or opening the doors of a forgotten barn. You see an old truck buried under dust. At first, you don't recognize it. The body is rough, the paint is faded. Maybe the tires have been sitting flat for decades. You wipe away some dirt from the grill and suddenly see the Mack name staring back at you. You would probably think you had discovered an old Mack truck, but then you realize how small it is. You start looking at the details, the shape, the proportions, the cab, the strange little body, and eventually you realize this isn't some homemade conversion or obscure aftermarket truck. This is an actual factory-built Mack ED, and that's the moment the discovery becomes something completely different. Because now you're standing in front of a truck that very few people alive today have probably seen in person. Only 2,686 were built, and after more than 80 decades of accidents, corrosion, neglect, modifications, scrapping, and simple disappearance, only a tiny number are believed to survive. Every surviving example is therefore much more than an old truck. It's a survivor from a very specific moment when Mack decided to step outside its comfort zone. So the next time you hear the name Mack, don't only picture those giant heavy-duty trucks with enormous grills and massive engines. Remember that once upon a time, Mack built something much smaller, something so unusual that today finding one can feel almost like discovering a lost chapter of American trucking history. And the strangest part, there were thousands of these little Macks on the road when they were new. Today, seeing one can feel like you've discovered something that was never supposed to survive.
Number 2. 1955 International R120. This truck is one of those vehicles that can fool you for a few seconds. At first glance, it looks like a classic 1950s American pickup. Rounded fenders, a wide grille, a simple cab, and that unmistakable shape that immediately takes you back to the golden age of American trucks. You might look at it and think, yeah, another old pickup from the 1950s. But then you notice the badge, and that's when the story gets much more interesting. Because this isn't a Ford, it isn't a Chevrolet, it isn't a Dodge. This is an International R120. And honestly, that's probably why so many people today have never heard of it. International was a major name in American trucks, but its history doesn't get nearly as much attention as the big three. For decades, International Harvester built trucks for farmers, businesses, construction companies, delivery operators, and people who needed something tougher than an ordinary passenger car. The company had a serious reputation among people who actually depended on their trucks. But outside that world, the name slowly faded from popular memory. The R120 came from a time when American pickup trucks were beginning to change dramatically. By 1955, the pickup wasn't just a bare-bones work machine anymore. Manufacturers were starting to make trucks look more stylish, more comfortable, and more appealing to ordinary drivers. The idea of using a pickup as an everyday vehicle was becoming increasingly attractive. And International understood that change. The R120 had the kind of styling that immediately screams mid-1950s America. It has those beautiful rounded lines and carefully shaped body panels that make old trucks from this period so recognizable. But there's something different about seeing that design wearing an International badge. It feels familiar and unfamiliar at the same time. You recognize the era immediately, but you may not recognize the truck. And that's exactly what makes it such a great forgotten classic. Think about how many Ford and Chevrolet pickups from the 1950s you've probably seen. Their names became legendary, their styling became collectible. Their surviving examples were restored, photographed, displayed at shows, and passed from one collector to another. But trucks like the R120 didn't receive quite the same level of attention. And there was a very practical reason for that. These trucks were built to work. Nobody bought an International R120 in the 1950s because they were thinking about what it might be worth 70 years later. A farmer wasn't parking it in a climate-controlled garage because someday collectors might fight over it. A contractor wasn't worrying about preserving the original paint. A small business owner wasn't thinking about automotive history. They were buying a truck because they needed a truck. It had a job to do. And once you understand that, the rarity of surviving examples starts to make much more sense. Imagine what happened to these trucks over the next few decades. They were driven through winters, exposed to rain and snow, loaded with heavy equipment, repaired when necessary, repainted when the original finish became too rough, and modified as owners found new ways to keep them useful. Some were converted into farm vehicles, some became parts donors, others simply worked until they couldn't work anymore. And when an old work truck finally became too expensive to repair, nobody was going to feel guilty about sending it to the scrapyard. That's how thousands of perfectly ordinary trucks disappear. But here's what makes the R120 especially fascinating. Today, the truck has the benefit of something it never had when it was new: mystery. A Ford pickup from 1955 can be instantly recognized. A Chevrolet from the same period can be identified from across a parking lot. But an International? A lot of people would walk right past it. You could actually show this truck to someone who loves classic cars, and there's a good chance they would know it's an old American pickup but have no idea who built it. And that says something about how quickly automotive history can change. International Harvester wasn't some tiny company that nobody had ever heard of. It was a major American manufacturer with a huge presence in agriculture and commercial vehicles. Yet today, many younger enthusiasts know the International name mainly because they've encountered one of the company's older trucks by accident. That's why the R120 feels almost like a forgotten branch of American automotive history. You're looking at a survivor from a forgotten American truck company, a machine that spent decades doing real work, disappeared from the spotlight, and somehow managed to survive long enough for us to finally realize how special it was. That's what makes the R120 so fascinating. It wasn't designed to become a legend, it was designed to work. And somehow, surviving all these decades has made it one.
Number 3, 1957 Dodge Swept Side. The first time I saw this truck, I honestly thought someone had built it themselves. I couldn't understand what I was looking at. It had the basic shape of a pickup, but something about the rear end looked completely wrong, or maybe completely brilliant. Instead of the usual straight, practical pickup bed, Dodge had given this truck the kind of dramatic rear fenders you would expect to see on a glamorous 1950s passenger car. And that's when I realized this wasn't some strange custom creation sitting in someone's garage. This was a factory-built Dodge. The 1957 Dodge Swept Side is one of those trucks that makes you stop and stare because it completely ignores the normal rules of what a pickup was supposed to look like. In the 1950s, a pickup was primarily a working machine. You bought one because you needed to carry something. The bed was supposed to be practical, the body was supposed to be durable, and nobody expected a work truck to look like a luxury automobile. Dodge apparently didn't get that message. Instead, they decided to take a pickup and give it styling that looked like it belonged on a flashy 1950s sedan. And the result was the Swept Side. Look closely at the rear of this thing and you'll understand why it became so unusual. The rear fenders weren't simply part of a conventional pickup design. They were styled to resemble the sweeping rear quarter shapes of Dodge's passenger cars. The effect was almost surreal. From certain angles, the truck looks like two completely different vehicles were somehow welded together. Up front, you have a pickup. In the middle, you have a traditional truck cab. And then you get to the back, and suddenly it looks like a glamorous 1950s automobile. That sounds strange today, but remember what was happening in America at the time. The late 1950s were the height of the American automotive design explosion. Cars were getting bigger, chrome was everywhere, tail fins were growing, and manufacturers were competing to create the most dramatic-looking vehicles on the road. Dodge wanted its trucks to participate in that design revolution too. The idea was surprisingly clever. Why should someone who needed a pickup have to drive something that looked completely utilitarian? Why couldn't a truck owner have something that looked stylish enough to turn heads? Why couldn't a working vehicle have some of the glamour of a passenger car? The swept side was Dodge's answer. And honestly, it was a wild answer. Instead of creating an entirely separate body from scratch, Dodge used existing components and combined them with distinctive styling elements to create something that looked dramatically different from an ordinary pickup. That helped give the swept side its unusual appearance, while also making it stand out in a market full of increasingly similar-looking trucks. But here's the part that makes the swept side story even more interesting. Dodge wasn't trying to build some giant production phenomenon. This was a niche idea. The swept side was created for buyers who wanted something different, someone who needed the usefulness of a pickup but didn't want to drive around in a truck that looked completely basic. And because it was such an unusual concept, it never became the kind of pickup you saw everywhere. That's a big reason why seeing one today can feel so strange. Imagine being in a small American town in 1957 and seeing one of these drive down the street. You would already be used to seeing Dodge cars and conventional Dodge pickups. But then this thing appears, and the rear fenders look like they belong to a completely different vehicle. You'd probably turn your head. Maybe you'd wonder if it was some custom-built truck. Maybe you'd assume the owner had modified it. And then you'd realize Dodge actually sold it that way. That's what I love about this truck. It has the kind of design that makes you question whether you're looking at an original vehicle. And that reaction hasn't really disappeared. Even today, when you see a beautifully restored swept side, it can still look like somebody went completely overboard with a custom project. The difference is that this strange combination of pickup practicality and passenger car styling actually came from the factory. And then there's the name itself, swept side. It's a perfect name for what Dodge was trying to accomplish. The body lines sweep toward the rear, creating that distinctive passenger car appearance. The styling wasn't subtle. Dodge wanted people to notice, and they certainly succeeded. But there is an important difference between being memorable and being successful. The swept side was memorable. It was unusual. It was eye-catching. But it never became the dominant pickup in America. And that's part of what makes it valuable to collectors today. Because decades later, rarity completely changes the way we look at vehicles like this. In 1957, you could simply think of the swept side as an interesting Dodge pickup. Today, every surviving example tells a much bigger story about how American manufacturers were experimenting with the idea of making trucks more stylish. And the timing couldn't have been better for something this crazy. America was obsessed with automotive design. Cars were becoming symbols of personal success. People weren't satisfied with transportation anymore. They wanted something that expressed their personality. Manufacturers knew this, and they started pushing styling into places that had never gone before. The swept side was basically that philosophy applied to a pickup. It was Dodge saying, "Why can't a truck be beautiful too?" And somehow, against all odds, a small number survived long enough for us to finally appreciate just how crazy and brilliant that idea really was.
Number 4. 1957 Ford Ranchero. The first time you see a 1957 Ford Ranchero, there's a good chance your brain doesn't know exactly what it's looking at. From the front, it looks like a full-size American car from the golden age of Detroit. Long hood, wide body, plenty of chrome, and that unmistakable late 1950s styling. But then your eyes move toward the back, and suddenly the car has an open pickup bed. That's the moment the Ranchero starts to make sense. Or maybe it makes even less sense, because Ford had taken something that Americans already understood, a large passenger car, and combined it with something completely different, a pickup truck. The result was the 1957 Ford Ranchero, and honestly, it looks like someone at Ford asked a question that probably sounded ridiculous at the time. What if we took a car and turned the back into a truck? Today, that idea sounds completely normal. We have seen decades of car-based pickups, crossover trucks, lifestyle vehicles, and practical cars with open cargo areas. But in 1957, the Ranchero was a genuinely unusual idea. It wasn't a traditional pickup truck, yet it wasn't really a normal passenger car either. It lived somewhere in between. And that strange combination is exactly what makes the Ranchero so fascinating. Think about what a pickup looked like in America during the 1950s. It was usually obvious what it was. You had a separate cab, a traditional truck chassis, and a bed designed specifically for hauling. The truck looked like a truck. The Ranchero broke that visual language completely. Ford started with its full-size passenger car architecture and created an open cargo area behind the cabin. Instead of looking like a small truck, the Ranchero looked like a giant American car that had somehow lost its trunk and gained a pickup bed. And that's why seeing one today can still be such a strange experience. You recognize the front end immediately. You know you're looking at a classic Ford, but the proportions suddenly change when you reach the rear. It almost feels like two different vehicles were combined into one. And yet, somehow, it works. The timing was perfect because America was changing rapidly in the 1950s. Cars were becoming more than simple transportation. They represented freedom, success, personality, and lifestyle. At the same time, people still needed practical vehicles for farms, small businesses, deliveries, and everyday hauling. Ford saw an opportunity sitting right between those two worlds. Why force someone to own a passenger car and a pickup truck when perhaps one vehicle could do both? That was the basic appeal of the Ranchero. During the week, it could carry cargo. On the weekend, it could look like a stylish American automobile. And compared with a traditional truck, it had a completely different personality. That's what I find so interesting about it. Ford wasn't simply trying to make another pickup, they were trying to change what people thought a pickup could be. And when you look at the 1957 Ranchero, you can see how strongly Ford leaned into that idea. This wasn't some tiny experimental utility vehicle that looked unfinished. It had the full visual drama of 1950s America. The body was large, the styling was dramatic, chrome was everywhere, the front end had presence, and the car-like proportions made it look almost luxurious compared with a traditional work truck. Then you reached the back and realized you could throw a load of equipment into it. That's almost absurd when you think about it. Imagine walking into a Ford dealership in 1957 and seeing one parked beside ordinary sedans. You might assume it was some kind of dealer-built custom. Maybe a local body shop had modified a Ford car. Maybe someone had cut the rear section away and fabricated a pickup bed. But no, Ford actually built it.
Number 5. 1958 GMC Suburban Carrier. This is one of those trucks that makes you wonder how an entire vehicle could simply disappear from popular memory. The first time I came across the 1958 GMC Suburban Carrier, I honestly wasn't even sure what I was looking at. It didn't have the familiar proportions of a normal pickup, but it wasn't a conventional panel truck either. It looked like GMC had taken several different ideas about what a truck should be and somehow pushed them into one unusual machine. And the more you look at it, the stranger the idea becomes. Because in the late 1950s, GMC was experimenting with something that sounds surprisingly modern, a truck designed around how people actually wanted to use cargo space. That sounds simple today, but back then, trucks were still divided into very obvious categories. You had pickups for open cargo, panel trucks for enclosed cargo, and larger commercial vehicles for heavier work. Each one had a specific purpose. If you needed an open bed, you bought a pickup. If you needed enclosed storage, you bought a panel truck. The Suburban Carrier blurred that line. And that's exactly why it is so fascinating. Look at the body and you immediately notice that it doesn't behave like a normal pickup. It has a more enclosed, utility-focused shape, but the design still gives the driver access to a cargo area in a way that makes it feel more like a hybrid between several different truck concepts. It almost looks like GMC was asking a question that nobody had really figured out how to answer yet. What if one truck could be configured around the cargo instead of forcing the owner to choose a traditional body style? That idea might sound obvious today, but in the 1950s it was much more unusual. And there's a reason these kinds of trucks are so easy to forget. They were built for people who needed them, not for collectors, not for car shows, not for people who wanted to preserve a piece of automotive history. They were working machines. A small business could use one for deliveries. A contractor could carry equipment. A service company could transport tools and materials. A shop owner could load supplies into it. Someone running a local business could depend on it every single day. And when a truck spends its life working, its chances of surviving for 70 years aren't exactly great. Think about what happened to a vehicle like this over the decades. It might have spent its first years carrying heavy cargo around town. Then perhaps a second owner bought it cheaply when it became too old for commercial work. Maybe it was used on a farm. Maybe someone removed parts to keep another GMC running. Maybe it sat outside for years until rust began eating away at the body. Eventually, someone had to make a decision: restore it or scrap it. And most of the time, a forgotten commercial truck didn't receive the same sympathy as a famous muscle car or a rare sports car. That's how vehicles like the suburban carrier vanish. And that's why surviving examples today are so fascinating. You're looking at a vehicle that was never designed to become famous. It was designed to solve a practical problem. And that practical purpose is exactly what makes it historically interesting. Because the late 1950s were a fascinating period for American trucks. Manufacturers were beginning to realize that customers weren't all using trucks in exactly the same way. The traditional pickup was useful but not perfect for every job. A panel truck was useful but not perfect either. So companies like GMC started experimenting with combinations. The suburban carrier was part of that experimentation. And honestly, when you look at it through modern eyes, the concept feels almost like an early version of today's specialized utility vehicles. Instead of building one truck and telling customers how to use it, manufacturers were beginning to think about different cargo needs and different types of customers. That was a big change. And GMC was right in the middle of it. But the strangest thing about this truck isn't just the way it was designed, it's how little people remember it. Ask someone to name a famous GMC from the 1950s and they'll probably think of a conventional pickup, maybe a larger truck, maybe something with a recognizable grille. Very few people would immediately mention the suburban carrier. That's what makes it such a great forgotten machine. It isn't famous enough for everyone to know it. It isn't common enough to be seen everywhere, and it doesn't fit neatly into the categories people use to remember old trucks. It's basically automotive history hiding in plain sight. Imagine seeing one brand new in 1958. The chrome would be bright, the body would be clean, the tires would be fresh. It would probably look surprisingly futuristic compared to the work trucks people were used to seeing just a decade earlier. And the owner probably wouldn't have thought of it as anything special. They had a job to do. They needed cargo space. They needed something reliable. They needed a truck. That's it. They couldn't possibly know that decades later, enthusiasts would look at the same design and wonder how such an unusual vehicle ever existed. And somehow, surviving long enough to be remembered again has made this forgotten GMC one of the most fascinating trucks from its era. Number 6. 1959 Chevrolet El Camino. The first time you see a 1959 Chevrolet El Camino, you might think someone had a very strange idea in their garage. It looks like a huge American passenger car from the late 1950s with an enormous front end, plenty of chrome, dramatic body lines, and the kind of styling that only Detroit could have produced at the height of the American automotive boom. But then you look toward the back, and suddenly the car turns into a pickup truck. And that's where the story gets really interesting. Because Chevrolet actually built this thing. This wasn't some one-off custom. It wasn't a backyard experiment. It wasn't an owner who decided to cut the rear half off an old Chevrolet and weld a cargo bed onto it. Chevrolet looked at the growing popularity of car-based utility vehicles and decided to try the idea itself. The result was the first-generation Chevrolet El Camino. And honestly, the timing makes perfect sense when you understand what was happening in America in 1959. This was the era when American cars were becoming enormous. Huge bodies, massive engines, acres of chrome, sweeping lines, and dramatic styling were everywhere. Car manufacturers were competing to make each new model look more impressive than the one before it. But at the same time, people still needed practical transportation. Farmers needed to carry equipment. Small businesses needed to move supplies. Tradesmen needed somewhere to put tools. Families wanted vehicles that could do more than simply carry passengers. So Chevrolet had an interesting problem. How do you build something practical without making it look like a boring work truck? Their answer was almost ridiculous in its simplicity. Take a big Chevrolet and give it a pickup bed. And somehow it worked. The 1959 El Camino is fascinating because it sits right at the intersection of two completely different worlds. From the front, it's pure late 1950s Chevrolet. From the back, it's a pickup truck. You get the styling, comfort, and road presence of a passenger car, but you also get an open cargo area. It's a car that wants to be a truck, and a truck that refuses to stop looking like a car. But here's the part many people don't realize. This first El Camino wasn't immediately the legendary vehicle that later generations became famous for. That's one of the most interesting parts of its story. When people hear El Camino today, they often picture the later models, the muscle car era, big engines, aggressive styling, and that unmistakable combination of performance and utility. The name eventually became iconic, but the beginning was much quieter. The 1959 version was almost like Chevrolet testing the waters. Would Americans actually want a vehicle like this? Would people accept a pickup that looked like a full-size car? Could a car-based truck compete with traditional pickups? Those questions were still unanswered, and Chevrolet's first attempt didn't become the instant sensation the company might have hoped for. That's why this early El Camino is so easy to overlook today. People remember the legend, they forget the experiment that came first, and that makes the 1959 model incredibly interesting. Imagine being a Chevrolet dealer in 1959 and having one of these sitting in the showroom. You would have regular Impalas and Bel Airs nearby, beautiful full-size cars with massive amounts of chrome. And then sitting among them is this strange machine with a cargo bed where the rear body should be. A customer walks in and asks, "What exactly is that?" And the salesman has to explain that it's a Chevrolet, but also a pickup. It's designed for someone who wants the comfort and appearance of a passenger car, but still needs to carry cargo. That must have been a fascinating sales pitch. Because the El Camino wasn't trying to convince traditional pickup buyers that they didn't need trucks. It was trying to convince car buyers that maybe they didn't need a separate truck at all. And that's a completely different idea. The vehicle was aimed at people who wanted versatility. Someone might drive it to work during the week, use it for errands, haul something in the bed on Saturday, and then drive it like a normal car on Sunday. That sounds completely ordinary today, but in 1959, it was still a strange concept. And then there's the styling. The 1959 Chevrolet is already one of the most recognizable American cars ever made. The design was dramatic, low, wide, and unmistakably from the late 1950s. Now, imagine taking that design language and replacing the rear passenger compartment with a cargo bed. It sounds like it shouldn't work, but somehow it does. The long body gives the El Camino an almost limousine-like appearance from certain angles. Then the open bed suddenly changes the entire personality of the vehicle. It's almost like Chevrolet couldn't decide whether it wanted to build a family car or a pickup, so it built both. And that's exactly why the El Camino became such an important idea in American automotive history. It proved that buyers didn't always want to choose between comfort and utility. But the 1959 model also teaches us something else. Not every good idea becomes an immediate success. Sometimes the first attempt arrives before the market is ready. Sometimes customers don't understand the idea yet, and sometimes a vehicle needs another generation before people finally realize what the manufacturer was trying to accomplish. That's essentially what happened with the El Camino concept. The first version came and went, and the name disappeared for a while before Chevrolet brought the El Camino concept back in a completely different era. And perhaps that's the most fascinating thing about this forgotten Chevrolet. It didn't become legendary because everyone immediately understood it. It became legendary because Chevrolet was willing to try something that looked crazy before the rest of the world knew what to do with it.
Number 7. 1960 Studebaker Champ.
The first time I saw this truck, I honestly didn't know what I was looking at. My eyes immediately went to the front end, and for a second I thought I was looking at some strange 1960s Studebaker passenger car. The grille, the headlights, the shape of the hood, everything seemed far too sleek and car-like for what was supposed to be a working pickup. Then I noticed the bed, and that's when the whole thing became even more interesting. This was the 1960 Studebaker Champ, one of the most unusual pickups to come out of an American manufacturer that was already known for doing things differently. And if you think the Champ looks strange today, imagine what it must have looked like when it was brand new. The early 1960s were supposed to be the future. American designers were obsessed with making vehicles look modern, aerodynamic, sophisticated, and even slightly futuristic. Cars were getting lower, wider, and more dramatic. Manufacturers were trying to convince buyers that every new model year represented another step toward tomorrow. Most pickup trucks, however, were still somewhere between the old world and the new one. They were practical, they were tough, they were built to work, but they usually looked like trucks. Studebaker decided that didn't necessarily have to be the case. Instead of giving the Champ the conventional truck face you might expect, Studebaker gave it a front end that looked remarkably similar to the company's passenger cars. That single decision completely changed the personality of the truck. Suddenly, this wasn't just another pickup. It looked like a passenger car that had somehow been transformed into a work vehicle. And that's exactly why the Champ can fool you even today. You can look at a photograph and immediately recognize the 1960s styling, but your brain still struggles to classify the vehicle. It has the stance of a pickup, but the face of a car. It has a cargo bed, but the front end looks almost elegant. It's practical and futuristic at the same time. That combination was incredibly unusual. But there's something even more fascinating about the Champ. Studebaker was fighting for survival. By 1960, Studebaker wasn't the giant American manufacturer that many people imagine when they hear the word automaker. The company had a long and impressive history, but it was facing serious financial pressure and intense competition from much larger rivals. Ford and Chevrolet had enormous resources. Studebaker didn't. So the company had to be creative. And the Champ is a perfect example of that creativity. Studebaker didn't have to follow everyone else. In fact, being different was one of the few advantages the company still had. If Ford could sell a familiar pickup, Studebaker needed buyers to look twice, and the Champ definitely gave them a reason. Imagine walking into a dealership in 1960. You see rows of conventional trucks from the big manufacturers. They have familiar grills, familiar proportions, and familiar styling. Then you see the Studebaker Champ sitting there. The first thing you notice is the front. It doesn't look like the truck next to it. It looks almost like a completely different type of vehicle. And that's probably exactly what Studebaker wanted. The company was essentially saying, you don't have to buy the same truck everyone else is driving. That idea sounds incredibly modern. Today, manufacturers spend enormous amounts of money trying to make their vehicles distinctive. They want a recognizable grille, unusual headlights, unique body lines, and a design that people can identify from a distance. Studebaker was already playing that game in 1960. But there was a price to being different. The Champ arrived at a difficult moment for Studebaker, and the company simply didn't have the production scale or financial strength of its biggest competitors. Even an interesting and genuinely clever truck could struggle to survive in that environment. And that's one reason the Champ became such a forgotten vehicle. It wasn't forgotten because it was boring. It was forgotten because the company behind it eventually disappeared from the mainstream American automotive industry. That makes surviving Champs especially fascinating, because you're not just looking at an old pickup, you're looking at a survivor from one of America's most important independent automobile manufacturers, a company that had been building vehicles for generations but was slowly running out of time. And imagine what happened to these trucks after they left the dealership. They worked. A Champ might have spent years hauling tools, supplies, equipment, or farm materials. It may have been driven every day through snow, rain, mud, and dirt. The owner wasn't thinking about preserving the original grille or protecting the bodywork. They needed it to do its job. And once the truck became old, its fate was often brutal. It could be repaired with used parts. It could be modified. It could be repainted. It could be pushed into farm service. It could become a second or third vehicle. And eventually, if something major failed, the owner might just decide it wasn't worth saving. That's how rare trucks disappear. Not dramatically, not all at once, one at a time. A rusted body here, an accident there, another truck stripped for parts, another one abandoned behind a barn. After enough decades, a vehicle that was once visible all over America can become something you almost never see. And today, finding an original Champ can feel almost like finding a piece of that lost battle, still sitting there decades later, quietly proving that Studebaker was willing to do things differently.
Number 8. 1961 Ford Ecoline Pickup.
The first time I saw this truck, I honestly thought somebody had taken a normal American pickup and turned it around. The proportions just didn't make sense. Where is the long hood? Where is the enormous front end? Where's the engine sitting out in front of the driver? None of it was there. Instead, the windshield seemed to begin almost immediately above the front wheels. And that's when I realized what I was looking at. This was the 1961 Ford Ecoline pickup, a truck that looked almost completely alien compared with the giant American pickups people usually associate with the early 1960s. At a time when American vehicles were getting bigger and bigger, Ford decided to go in the exact opposite direction. Smaller, shorter, more compact, and incredibly strange looking. The Ecoline was built around a cab-over design, meaning the driver sat much farther forward than in a conventional pickup. Instead of having a long hood stretching out in front, the driver was positioned almost directly over the front axle. That one decision transformed the entire shape of the truck. And honestly, it made the Ecoline look like something from another country. That's because Americans were used to a very specific idea of what a pickup should be. Long hood, separate cab, large engine compartment, open bed, big, wide stance. The Ecoline ignored almost all of that. It looked more like a compact delivery vehicle that had somehow decided to become a pickup, and that's exactly why it was so clever. Ford wasn't trying to compete with the F-Series by simply making another conventional pickup. The company was targeting a completely different kind of customer. A small business owner didn't necessarily need a huge truck. A city worker didn't necessarily need a massive engine. A delivery company didn't necessarily need something that took up half the street. They needed something compact, maneuverable, economical, and useful. The Ecoline was Ford's answer. And when you think about the early 1960s, the timing becomes even more interesting. American cars were enormous. Full-size sedans could be extremely long and wide. Parking spaces weren't always designed for today's kind of traffic because vehicles were simply becoming larger. Then, Ford introduced something that looked almost tiny by comparison. Imagine seeing one of these for the first time in 1961. You might have thought Ford had lost its mind. Why would anyone want a pickup this short? Why would anyone want the driver sitting so far forward? Why get rid of the long hood that made American trucks look powerful? But once you understood what the truck was designed to do, the strange shape suddenly made sense. It was all about efficiency. The cab-over layout allowed Ford to put more usable vehicle into a smaller overall footprint. The front end wasn't being wasted on a long hood. The cab could be pushed forward and the truck could remain surprisingly compact while still providing useful cargo capacity. For city businesses, that mattered. A plumber could drive it through narrow streets. A delivery company could park it in tighter spaces. A tradesman could carry tools without needing a giant truck. A small business could get a practical commercial vehicle without buying something enormous. And suddenly, that strange little Ford didn't seem so strange anymore. It made sense. But there was still one major problem. It looked nothing like what people expected a Ford pickup to look like. The F-Series was becoming a familiar part of American life. People knew what a Ford truck looked like. It had a traditional shape and a certain visual toughness. The Ecoline was almost the opposite. It looked friendly, compact, almost industrial, and from certain angles, it barely looked like a pickup at all. That's why seeing one today can still be such a shock. You expect to see a 1961 Ford with a long hood and a conventional cab. Instead, you see a little boxy machine with the driver sitting almost at the very front. It looks like Ford took a European idea and dropped it in the middle of America. And that impression isn't completely surprising. Cab-over trucks were already common in other parts of the world, especially where compact dimensions were more important. Ford was adapting that kind of thinking for the American market, and it was a bold move. Because Ford could have simply played it safe. They could have built another conventional pickup. Instead, they decided that not every truck needed to be huge. And that decision turned out to be extremely important. The Ecoline concept would eventually become a major part of Ford's commercial vehicle history. What looked strange at first would become a familiar formula for vans and compact commercial vehicles. But the pickup version is much easier to forget. And that's where the story becomes fascinating again. Most people remember the Ecoline as a van. They remember the boxy little Ford commercial vehicles that became common in cities and businesses. But the pickup version? That's another story. It existed briefly as part of Ford's early Ecoline experiment, and today it can feel like a forgotten prototype from an alternate automotive timeline. Except, it wasn't a prototype. Ford actually sold it. And yet, Ford actually built it, sold it, and put it to work on American roads. More than 60 decades later, that strange little truck has become a reminder that sometimes the most important ideas don't arrive looking impressive. Sometimes they arrive looking completely wrong. Until you understand what they were trying to accomplish.
Number 9. 1963 Jeep J-Series Gladiator.
I honestly wasn't prepared for how big this truck was the first time I saw it. When most people hear the word Jeep, they immediately picture something rugged, compact, and built to crawl over rocks. A little off-road machine that can squeeze through places where ordinary vehicles simply can't go. So when you see a 1963 Jeep Gladiator, the first reaction is almost always the same. Wait, Jeep built this? Because this wasn't some tiny utility vehicle. This was a serious, full-size pickup, and that completely changes the story. The 1963 Jeep J-Series Gladiator was Jeep's bold attempt to step directly into the world of full-size American trucks. At a time when Ford, Chevrolet, GMC, and Dodge were fighting for buyers with increasingly large pickups, Jeep decided it wanted a place at the same table. But Jeep had something those companies didn't have in quite the same way: four-wheel drive credibility. Jeep had already built an incredible reputation for rugged off-road vehicles. The brand was associated with military service, rough terrain, trails, farms, and places where normal passenger cars simply couldn't survive. Now, imagine taking that reputation and stretching it into a full-size pickup. That's the Gladiator. And the result is one of those trucks that feels almost like two different ideas combined into one machine. On one side, you have Jeep's rugged four-wheel drive heritage. On the other, you have a large American pickup designed to carry serious loads and compete with the biggest trucks on the market. That combination was unusual, and it made the Gladiator one of the most interesting trucks of its era. The first thing that stands out is the size. This thing doesn't look like the little Jeep most people imagine. The body is long, the wheelbase is substantial. The cargo bed gives it the unmistakable appearance of a full-size work truck. The cab has the upright, functional look of a vehicle designed to do a job rather than simply look good outside a house. Yet the Jeep badge completely changes how you perceive it. Because you're used to seeing Jeeps on trails. You're used to seeing them climbing hills, crossing mud, and crawling over rocks. But here was Jeep saying, what if we build a truck that can do serious work and still go places a normal full-size pickup can't? That was a powerful idea. And in 1963, it was surprisingly ambitious. The American truck market was becoming extremely competitive. Ford had its F-Series, Chevrolet had its CK trucks, GMC had its own lineup. Dodge was fighting for customers too. These companies had enormous manufacturing resources and decades of experience building trucks. Jeep was the outsider. But sometimes being the outsider gives you an advantage. Jeep didn't need to copy everyone else exactly. It could build a truck around the thing people already trusted Jeep for: getting through difficult terrain. And that gave the Gladiator a personality that was very different from an ordinary full-size pickup. Imagine buying one in 1963. Maybe you were a farmer who needed a truck that could carry equipment but also handle muddy fields. Maybe you worked in construction and needed to reach remote sites. Maybe you lived somewhere with rough roads where a conventional two-wheel drive pickup could become useless after a heavy storm. The Gladiator made a compelling promise. It wasn't simply a truck, it was a Jeep truck, and that distinction mattered. Because the Gladiator wasn't trying to convince people that Jeep had suddenly become Ford. It was trying to convince them that Jeep could build a full-size pickup while keeping the rugged personality that made the brand famous. And honestly, looking at one today, that idea still makes sense. The styling is unmistakably from the early 1960s, but there's something almost timeless about the basic shape. The grille is simple and functional, the cab is upright, the body is muscular without being covered with unnecessary decoration. It looks like a truck that expects to work. But then you remember how unusual that was coming from Jeep, and that's where the story gets even better. Because Jeep wasn't just building a truck. The company was experimenting with the idea that its off-road reputation could be expanded into a much larger vehicle category. The Gladiator was a statement. Jeep was no longer only about small, rugged vehicles. It could build something big. It could build something powerful. It could compete with the giants. And it could do it while keeping four-wheel drive at the center of the story. That's why I think the Gladiator deserves much more attention from people who love classic American trucks. Most people know Jeep. Most people know the classic Jeep silhouette. But ask them about a 1963 Gladiator, and you might get a completely different reaction. Jeep made a full-size pickup? Exactly. And that surprise is part of what makes this truck so memorable. But there was another reason these trucks were vulnerable to disappearing. They were working vehicles. A Gladiator wasn't necessarily purchased as a collectible. It was purchased because someone needed a truck. That meant it could spend years carrying heavy loads, pulling equipment, crossing rough roads, and working in conditions that would be terrible for a vehicle someone was trying to preserve. A truck like this could be beaten up for decades and still be expected to start every morning. And perhaps that's the perfect description of the Gladiator, a Jeep that refused to stay small. It took everything people expected from Jeep, toughness, four-wheel drive, and off-road ability, and placed it inside a full-size American pickup. The result wasn't ordinary. It was one of the boldest and most overlooked trucks of its era.
Number 10. 1964 Ford Ranchero. The first time I saw a 1964 Ford Ranchero, I honestly couldn't decide what I was looking at. It had a cargo bed, so technically it was a pickup. But everything about the front half looked like it belonged to a sporty American passenger car. The long hood, the low stance, the sculpted body lines. None of it screamed work truck. And that's exactly what made the 1964 Ranchero so interesting. Ford had taken the original idea of a car-based pickup and pushed it in a completely different direction. The Ranchero was no longer simply a practical vehicle for someone who needed a little extra cargo space. By the mid-1960s, it was becoming something much more stylish, much more personal, and increasingly connected to the performance car culture that was exploding across America. In other words, Ford was slowly turning the pickup into something people might actually want to drive for fun. And when you look at the 1964 model, you can see the transition happening right in front of you. The early Ranchero had always been unusual because it combined a passenger car with an open cargo bed. But by 1964, the concept had become much more sophisticated. The truck-like appearance was fading, while the passenger car character was becoming stronger. That's what makes this particular Ranchero such a fascinating piece of American automotive history. It was caught between two worlds. It wasn't a traditional pickup, it wasn't a conventional sedan, and it wasn't quite a muscle car, but somehow it borrowed something from all three. Think about what was happening in America at the beginning of the 1960s. The automotive industry was changing incredibly quickly. The enormous chrome-heavy designs of the late 1950s were starting to give way to cleaner, more aggressive shapes. Young buyers were becoming increasingly interested in performance. Manufacturers were realizing that people didn't just want transportation, they wanted cars that felt exciting. And Ford was paying very close attention. The Ranchero was perfectly positioned for this new era. It already had something ordinary cars didn't have, an open cargo bed. But it also had something traditional pickups didn't always offer, the visual personality of a passenger car. Number 10. 1964 Ford Ranchero. The first time I saw a 1964 Ford Ranchero, I honestly couldn't decide what I was looking at. It had a cargo bed, so technically it was a pickup. But everything about the front half looked like it belonged to a sporty American passenger car. The long hood, the low stance, the sculpted body lines. None of it screamed work truck. And that's exactly what made the 1964 Ranchero so interesting. Ford had taken the original idea of a car-based pickup and pushed it in a completely different direction. The Ranchero was no longer simply a practical vehicle for someone who needed a little extra cargo space. By the mid-1960s, it was becoming something much more stylish, much more personal, and increasingly connected to the performance car culture that was exploding across America. In other words, Ford was slowly turning the pickup into something people might actually want to drive for fun. And when you look at the 1964 model, you can see the transition happening right in front of you. The early Ranchero had always been unusual because it combined a passenger car with an open cargo bed. But by 1964, the concept had become much more sophisticated. The truck-like appearance was fading, while the passenger car character was becoming stronger. That's what makes this particular Ranchero such a fascinating piece of American automotive history. It was caught between two worlds. It wasn't a traditional pickup, it wasn't a conventional sedan, and it wasn't quite a muscle car, but somehow it borrowed something from all three. Think about what was happening in America at the beginning of the 1960s. The automotive industry was changing incredibly quickly. The enormous chrome-heavy designs of the late 1950s were starting to give way to cleaner, more aggressive shapes. Young buyers were becoming increasingly interested in performance. Manufacturers were realizing that people didn't just want transportation, they wanted cars that felt exciting, and Ford was paying very close attention. The Ranchero was perfectly positioned for this new era. It already had something ordinary cars didn't have, an open cargo bed. But it also had something traditional pickups didn't always offer, the visual personality of a passenger car. That combination suddenly became much more appealing as American car culture shifted toward performance and individuality. Imagine being a young driver in 1964. You might want something sporty, you might want something that looks cool cruising down the street, but maybe you also had practical needs. Maybe you carried tools. Maybe you worked on cars. Maybe you went hunting or camping. Maybe you simply liked the idea of having an open cargo area. Why should you have to choose between a sporty car and a pickup? The Ranchero offered a strange answer. Don't choose. And that's the genius of the concept. The 1964 Ranchero could look perfectly comfortable parked outside a suburban home, yet it still had a bed that could be used for real cargo. It could be practical when necessary and stylish the rest of the time. That made it a very different kind of vehicle from the average work truck, and it also helped create the idea of the pickup as a lifestyle vehicle. Today, that idea is everywhere. People buy pickups even when they rarely haul anything. They want the image, the versatility, the driving position, the ability to carry outdoor equipment, and the feeling that their vehicle can do almost anything. The Ranchero was part of the early development of that philosophy, and that's why the 1964 model deserves more attention than it sometimes gets. It wasn't just another year of the Ranchero, it represented a shift. The Ranchero was becoming less of a utility vehicle and more of a personal statement, and Ford was doing this at exactly the right time. The American performance car revolution was just beginning to explode. Within a few years, muscle cars would dominate magazines, dealerships, drag strips, and the imaginations of young drivers across the country. Ford would have the Mustang, Chevrolet would have the Camaro, Dodge and Plymouth would create their own performance legends. And sitting somewhere between those worlds was the Ranchero. It wasn't quite a muscle car, but it could still carry cargo. That unusual combination is what makes it so memorable. And then you realize just how strange the idea actually was. Imagine telling someone in 1964 that one day people would collect old cars specifically because they looked like a combination of a sports car and a pickup. They probably would have thought you were joking. To the original owner, this was simply a Ford. Maybe it was a daily driver. Maybe it was a work vehicle. Maybe it was a weekend cruiser. Maybe it was all three. Nobody knew that decades later, enthusiasts would look at these vehicles and see something special. And that's an important part of the story. Vehicles like the Ranchero were often used much harder than people realized. They weren't always carefully preserved. They were driven through bad weather. They carried heavy objects. They were parked outside. They were modified. Engines were swapped. Beds were scratched. Body panels were repaired. Some eventually became cheap second-hand transportation, and a strange little piece of American automotive history that helped prove that utility and style didn't necessarily have to be enemies. Once you understand that, the Ranchero stops looking like a strange old pickup. It starts looking like something much more important, one of the early machines that helped blur the line between the American car and the American truck, long before that idea became completely normal.